Well, I'm going to kick off because it was a kind of speak a wee bit about the context and the situation that we began to talk about one world issues in Carlisle. And I suppose it arose out of a change in the way that the churches worked together in the city. For a long time, it had been a council which had very little support. And then in 1989, in the whole of the UK, they set up a different organisation for ecumenical activity called Churches Together. And that set a different tone because it was much more about cooperating and collaborating and doing whatever we could together. And in Carlisle city centre, that began with the clergy initially having a chat about what we might do and talking about the strengths of our individual churches. So for instance, the Salvation Army had a great history and had an active outreach to homelessness. So we said, well, we should all support the Salvation Army in that. The Society of Friends and the Peace and Justice, the Roman Catholic Church, spirituality, prayer activity, the cathedral, very much part of the civic scene and connecting us with the city. And then for the little Church of Scotland up the back street in Chapel Street, we had quite a reputation for hospitality to the local community. If you know the location, we're also en route between the schools, Trinity and the college and the city centre. So we had quite a lot of footfall past the door. So hospitality and also our international links. So that set the basis for us beginning to talk about what we would do and how we would work together. And that took us into the 1990s. But we began to think specifically about what we might do on the international scene. So we had a link with someone called Betty Brame, and Shirley will just talk about that because that was the first step.
Yeah. I suppose that was maybe the late 80s when we were just discovering places in Cumbria and down in Caldbeck. Betty Brame had a little fair trade shop, and that was really our introduction, wasn't it, to fair trade. It was in what had been the bus shelter from the John Peel Memorial. Anyway, we got really involved, and I became a representative for Tradecraft at that time, and it grew and grew really. First of all, how we were going to have it in the church, and we just had it cornered off, a little fair trade shop which we opened once a week, and from there onto coffee mornings, Carlisle the Fair in August, we were part of that. And that grew and grew. We did quite a lot of fashion shows and different links with Gateshead, where the fair trade place was. But also at that time, I started studying with Open University on third world development issues and the environment. So all these things kind of came together in the 90s, really.
Yeah. And then the little congregation in Chapel, it wasn't so small a congregation, I think there was about 500 members around that time, but we began to talk about expansion of our premises. So that conversation began about 1992, 1993, and we decided that a lean-to at the back of the church, which was really needing attention, that would actually replace that with a new formal extension, which could also be entered through by the side of the church. We'd already thought of converting what had been a small room on the just off the pavement, and we spoke to the Kirk session about that, and they said, how much would it be to change it into a fair trade shop? And we said, oh, about £1,000 or something. And they said, oh no, that's far too much. So we went away and spoke to architects about an extension at the back of the church, and we came back with that and said to the Kirk session, and they said, and how much would that cost? And we said, well, about £200,000, and they voted for it unanimously. So always made us think, you've got to think big and rather not too small. Anyhow, that began a conversation with the other churches about how the new premises could be used ecumenically, and that would incorporate a cafe and a meeting space upstairs, and then in what was the attic area, a resource centre for One World activities. And then that began to formalise what we called at that stage the One World Network. So this was prior to the centre. The centre began once the building was completed about the mid-90s, but the decision to work with the premises is what brought all the churches, and we had about 50 volunteers running the cafe and various activities from right across the city. And we said that 10% of all the income would go towards the One World Network activities, and that took off. And the idea was that we would act and think locally as well as globally. And so from that, we began to think, how do we reach out into the community? So Shirley and others began to think about schools work and just lunches and international links.
So can you just clarify, you Bill, you were the...
I was a minister at Church of Scotland, and I had the congregation in Carlisle and a small congregation, about 70 members at Longtown. So there was the linkage between the two. And our nearest Church of Scotland partners, of course, were over the border in Gretna. But the building itself had been built next door to the original Roman Catholic Church. There was only 9 feet between the two buildings when they were built, and that became the passageway into the new One World Centre. So there was a real kind of ecumenical feel to that. They were both built in the 1830s when things opened up in Carlisle with the railway.
Brilliant, thanks. And Shirley, you said you took some studies on in global issues. Did you have a particular personal interest in getting involved in the centre and in all this work, fair trade and so on?
Yeah, and we had the opportunity at that time also to travel a bit. I remember the first person, I think, from the church that travelled abroad was Dilys Bonest from the church, and she went to Gambia, and she was just so full of it when she came back. And then I was asked to go on a Christian aid trip to Uganda, and I think, although I really enjoyed my studies and I thought I knew lots of things, it's only when you're with the people that you realise what it's about. And then I think I didn't stop talking about that trip to Uganda, so much so that the next year we both went to Malawi, Bill and I, and we were there for 10 weeks. And again, just being with people and learning so much. That linked with my studies, but really just opened up our eyes to so many issues, including HIV. So that was another thing that we used. And it was from these experiences that I went on to more in the development education and the involvement in schools. So we were involved with quite a few schools in Carlisle at the time.
And building up partnerships, weren't you, between schools here and overseas? That's right,
that's right. And building up resources from having these experiences, we then started developing resources.
And then summer clubs as well.
That was really the biggie before we left. Working with Kitty Booth-Clibborn and the development of a week of activities for young people, which then I think continued the next year after we left. So that was with the support of Oxfam and with Christian Aid to pay for that activity.
Yeah, they funded that, didn't they? Which was great to get that kind of outside support and encouragement, and also then beginning to think about not only the schools but the colleges, and that's when Ruth Harvey came on board, and Ruth Harvey began to develop the links with Carlisle College and the new university campus, and I can't remember how we found some funding to support that, but that was all really in the second half of the 90s, nearing the 2000 stage, wasn't it? And then bringing overseas partners, that was not just Church of Scotland links, but with Jim Hislop, he was bringing people over from India, and at one stage we had an Indian partner over, and he had the Dalit bishop
Yeah.
with them, so we had lots of activities around that time.
And I think through our links with Christian Aid, whenever they ever had visitors, you know, from the different countries, we hosted them, and an opportunity for them to talk, you know, within Carlisle as well.
Yeah, and then with the students, we started to have bistro nights, didn't we? So that brought international students together. So that was the kind of international side, but it was also to be the local too. So things like the food voucher scheme that we developed was really important. And the development of a credit union, which the discussions for that started in 2000, and then that was established in 2001, which as we're beginning to discuss charity status for the One World Centre itself. So although we called the bit upstairs in the Chapel Street the One World Centre, the dream had been that we would have somewhere that was actually in the city centre, that was us, that we are on neutral ground and owned by not just the churches but by the community as well.
Hello, my name's Kitty, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my history and background with the Carlisle One World Centre as it approaches its 20-year anniversary. I've been involved with the organisation since its inception. I moved to Carlisle around that time, late 1990s, early 2000s, having had a background working overseas for 6 years, and really felt I wanted to use that background living locally to improve understanding of local people about global issues. Just thinking that education of that kind is so important to our interaction with the world, and trying to rebalance some of the imbalances that exist, really. So I worked with Bill Brown when he first conceived of the One World Centre and got involved on the committee in those very early days when it was located at Chapel Street in offices above the Church of Scotland. Hazy memories, to be honest. Did lots of funding applications and trying to make things happen in really a pretty barren landscape at that time, around multiculturalism, social justice, those kind of things. It felt a little bit like pushing a boulder uphill at times, with a hardcore of very committed and enthusiastic people, but quite difficult to engage the wider population in what we were doing. I then took a break for a few years and came back onto the committee a few years later as secretary, and then ultimately as chair. And I just finished on the committee last year, feeling that my time with COWC as an active trustee had come to an end, but obviously still a huge supporter of the One World Centre's work. What I would reflect on is I think the landscape in Carlisle has changed enormously in the 20 years or so that the One World Centre has been in existence. I think there are organisations now active in similar arenas. So you've got Multicultural Cumbria, Anti-Racist Cumbria, Sustainable Carlisle, all of these kind of organisations where some of our objectives and ambitions overlap. And I think the absolute priority for the One World Centre going forward to sustain itself is to continue the very positive partnership working that it's done so successfully over many years, and really to continue to act as that catalyst for change and that driver. I think communication around all these issues is crucial, and we need it now more than ever as the world becomes more globalized but also more polarized. So I just wanted to mark some of my thoughts around the history of the One World Centre and congratulate everybody that's been involved in keeping it going for this long. I think as a small charity with very limited funding and one part-time member of staff, it's done extraordinarily well to have the profile that it has and to have made the achievements that it has. But we all know there's much still to do, and I hope that the One World Centre can be here in 20 years' time, still fighting for change, fighting for justice, and banging the drum for the people that don't have a voice.